The photograph was supposed to be harmless. A simple studio portrait, dated in careful ink on the back, showing a young couple seated stiffly beneath painted clouds, their faces arranged into the practiced calm of people told to hold still. Between them sat a baby wrapped in white cloth, eyes closed, mouth slightly open as if caught mid-breath. Nothing about it seemed unusual at first glance. Thousands of similar photographs existed in archives and family albums, silent witnesses to lives long gone. It wasn't until the image was cleaned that the unease began. The restoration process stripped away dust, scratches, and time. As clarity returned, the smiles became sharper, less forgiving. The parents' expressions no longer looked warm but strained, lips pulled tight, as though maintaining composure required effort. Their hands rested low, near the infant's torso, partially obscured by fabric and shadow, oddly positioned. Too deliberate, the lighting was wrong around their fingers. Studio lamps from that era cast predictable shadows, but these bent inward, collapsing toward the palms. Zoomed in further, the hands appeared tense, knuckles pale, tendons pronounced, gripping something that resisted being seen. The baby's blanket bulged unnaturally between them, as though concealing more than fragile limbs. Then came the reflections. Every photograph holds secrets in the eyes if the resolution is high enough. Within the parent's pupils, the expert noticed a dark shape repeated twice, identical in size and distance. Not a trick of light, not a flaw in the plate. Something small was being held up between them, close to the child's chest. Something they were careful not to reveal directly. The infant's skin, once assumed peaceful, now appeared waxen. Too still, and the date on the back written with confidence placed the photo after a death already recorded in municipal logs. The image was never about the baby. It was about what the parents were hiding and why they needed proof that, for one moment, it stayed exactly where they held it. The photograph entered the archive quietly, without ceremony or remark, one more square of sepia among thousands catalogued by date and location. It showed a young couple seated close together in a modest studio, their posture formal but not unusual for the era. The painted backdrop behind them suggested a soft countryside scene, the kind chosen to lend warmth and permanence to fleeting moments. Between the parents rested an infant wrapped carefully in white cloth, positioned so that its face was visible but its body remained mostly concealed. At first glance, the image appeared entirely ordinary, even comforting. A visual echo of countless family portraits meant to preserve happiness against the erosion of time. The couple's expressions seemed appropriate for the setting. The father's mouth curved into a restrained smile, neither joyful nor grim, while the mother's gaze held a calm seriousness that could easily be attributed to nerves or fatigue. Their eyes faced the camera directly, as was customary, unblinking and composed. Nothing about them invited suspicion. The baby's closed eyes suggested sleep, perhaps even a moment of peaceful rest captured by chance. In an archive filled with tragedies and celebrations alike, this photograph gave no immediate reason to linger. For decades, the image remained untouched, referenced only by its accession number and brief description. Studio portrait, family, infant, early 20th century. No accompanying letters, no notes of significance, no record of who the family was or why the photograph had been taken. It passed through hands that had learned not to ask questions of silent artifacts. Archivists, historians, and students glanced at it only long enough to confirm it matched its label before moving on to items more dramatic or clearly important. Time softened its edges. The surface developed fine scratches, the corners dulled, and a faint discoloration crept inward from the borders. Still, nothing about the damage hinted at anything unusual. It was the kind of photograph people expect to find in forgotten drawers or old albums, a fragment of an unremarkable life. Its anonymity protected it, allowing it to fade into obscurity without scrutiny. What made the photograph dangerous was not what it revealed, but what it concealed so successfully. Its normality acted as camouflage, discouraging deeper inspection. It offered familiarity instead of alarm, nostalgia instead of curiosity. In a collection built on the extraordinary, it was precisely its ordinariness that ensured it would be overlooked, quietly waiting for the moment when someone would finally look long enough to notice that it had never truly been harmless. The second phase began not with suspicion, but with routine preservation. The photograph was selected for digital restoration as part of a broader effort to stabilize aging materials, its surface damage now severe enough to warrant attention. Under high-resolution scanning, the image was broken down into layers of tone, contrast, and shadow, revealing details far subtler than the human eye could catch in its faded physical form. At this stage, nothing about the subject matter seemed alarming. The software corrected discoloration, reduced grain, and reconstructed missing fragments with mathematical precision. It was during the lighting correction that the first irregularities appeared. The studio where the photograph had been taken was known, its layout documented in other surviving portraits. Light sources in that space produced consistent shadow directions, falling gently behind subjects and tapering predictably across clothing and skin. In this image, however, the shadows around the parents' hands refused to behave. They bent inward rather than away, pooling too densely near the palms, as though the light itself were being absorbed. Magnification revealed tension where none should have existed. The parents' fingers were not relaxed, nor posed for elegance, but curled with intention. The knuckles appeared pale, the skin stretched tight over bone. These were not hands resting naturally for a portrait that required stillness, they were gripping. The more the clarity improved, the more obvious it became that both parents were exerting pressure, their hands mirroring each other in position and force. The pose was coordinated, rehearsed, and purposeful. The restoration expert initially assumed an error in the algorithm. Digital enhancement can exaggerate flaws or introduce distortions, especially in older prints, yet repeated scans produced the same result. Even when lighting corrections were disabled entirely, the unnatural density of shadow persisted. The contrast around the fingers remained inconsistent with the rest of the image, suggesting the presence of an object interrupting the expected fall of light. Subtle creases appeared in the infant's blanket, lines that did not align with the body beneath it. The cloth bulged slightly between the parents' hands, forming an outline that resisted identification. It was too firm to be fabric alone, too localized to be a fold caused by gravity. The blanket seemed stretched over something compact, something deliberately hidden from the camera's view. At this point, the photograph ceased to feel accidental. Every detail pointed to intention: the precise placement of the hands, the careful concealment beneath white cloth, the shared tension between the parents. What had once appeared as a gentle family portrait now suggested control rather than affection. The image was no longer just a record of people sitting still. It was evidence of an act frozen in time, one that relied on concealment and discipline. The restoration expert understood then that the photograph had survived not because it was unremarkable, but because it was convincing, hiding its disturbance behind technical familiarity and human composure, waiting for modern clarity to expose the strain that had always been there. As the resolution increased, the photograph began to surrender details that had never been meant to survive. High-definition scans allowed the image to be enlarged far beyond its original viewing scale, revealing textures and micro-reflections embedded in the glassy surface of the eyes. It was a well-known phenomenon among forensic analysts that eyes preserve more than expressions. They act as curved mirrors, capturing fragments of the environment at the moment the shutter closes. In most portraits, these reflections are meaningless streaks of light, easily dismissed as artifacts. In this image, they were not. Within each parent's pupil appeared the same shape, faint but unmistakably present. It hovered near the center of their gaze, identical in proportion and position, confirming it was not a coincidence or flaw in the plate. The reflection showed something dark and compact held at chest height between them. Its edges were irregular, organic rather than geometric, absorbing light instead of reflecting it. No studio equipment, props, or furniture matched the silhouette. Whatever it was, it had been close enough to dominate their visual field. Further enhancement clarified the distance and orientation of the object. The reflections suggested it was being held with both hands, centered deliberately in front of the infant. This aligned perfectly with the unnatural hand tension previously observed. The parents were not simply supporting the child. They were presenting something to the camera while ensuring it remained unseen. The realization reframed the entire composition. The baby, once thought to be the subject, now seemed secondary, almost incidental. Cross-checking the studio's archival records yielded no mention of props, religious items, or ceremonial objects used during that period. The establishment was conservative in its practices, catering to families and documenting milestones. Yet no description accompanied this session beyond the bare minimum. It was as if the photographer had been instructed not to notice. The more records were examined, the clearer it became that the omission was intentional. The reflections also exposed emotion, the faces themselves concealed. When isolated and enhanced, the parents' eyes revealed tension bordering on fear. Their focus was not on the camera lens but on the thing between them, as though maintaining control required constant attention. This explained the rigidity of their posture, the forced symmetry of their hands, and the unnatural stillness of the infant. The object's presence raised questions that documentation could not answer. It was too small to be a body, yet too substantial to be symbolic. It occupied space, demanded grip, and altered the behavior of everyone in the frame. Its purpose was unclear, but its importance was not. The photograph was no longer a simple portrait. It was a record of containment. What unsettled the expert most was the precision. Whatever the parents were holding, they knew exactly how to hide it while ensuring it was captured indirectly. The reflections were not an accident but an unavoidable consequence of being looked at too closely. The image had always contained the truth, waiting patiently for technology capable of seeing where human attention once refused to linger. The investigation widened beyond the photograph itself, moving into records that had not been examined together before. Once the date on the back of the image was confirmed, municipal archives were consulted to establish basic context. Birth registers, death certificates, and church burial logs from the same district were digitized and cross-referenced, a process that usually yielded predictable patterns. Families appeared, vanished, and reappeared in orderly timelines. This time, the sequence fractured. An infant death was recorded under the same family name, logged with clinical certainty and witnessed by a local physician. The cause was listed briefly, without elaboration, and the burial was documented 2 days prior to the date stamped on the photograph. At first, the discrepancy was attributed to clerical error. Such mistakes were common, especially in periods of disease or high mortality. Yet further verification removed that comfort. The burial record was corroborated by a church ledger and a cemetery map marking a small grave already in place. The physician's handwriting matched other verified entries. Everything pointed to the same conclusion: the child had been declared dead and laid to rest before the camera shutter ever closed. The photograph, therefore, could not depict a living infant in a conventional sense. This realization cast every previously noted detail into sharper relief. The baby's stillness, once interpreted as sleep, now appeared absolute. The waxen quality of the skin was no longer a trick of aging paper. The slightly open mouth suggested not breath, but absence. The parent's grip took on a new meaning, less about concealment and more about necessity. Medical historians consulted on the case noted that postmortem photography was practiced during that era, often as a way to memorialize children lost too young. However, such images followed recognizable conventions. Bodies were posed to simulate life, hands folded peacefully, expressions softened. This photograph violated those norms. The parents were not cradling the child but restraining something near it. The focus was not on remembrance, but on control. More troubling still was the absence of any notation indicating the photograph's purpose. Post-mortem portraits were typically labeled as such, sometimes even accompanied by mourning cards or inscriptions. Here, there was only silence. The lack of acknowledgement suggested secrecy rather than grief. It implied that the photograph was not intended for public remembrance, but for private assurance. The timing became impossible to ignore. If the child had died, and yet the parents had returned to the studio days later, then the act of being photographed served another function entirely. It was not about preserving a face, but about documenting a condition, a moment, or a result. The image now resembled proof more than memory. The expert understood then that the photograph marked a boundary between official history and something deliberately excluded from it, a moment where records claimed finality while the image suggested unfinished business still being held firmly in place. The final enhancement was applied with reluctance, not because of technical difficulty but because of what had already been uncovered. By this stage, the photograph had shed any claim to innocence. The restoration expert isolated the area between the parents' hands, layering contrast maps, edge detection, and spectral analysis to separate fabric from form. Each adjustment peeled back another veil, clarifying boundaries that had once blended seamlessly into shadow. What emerged was not dramatic in size, yet it carried a weight that altered the entire meaning of the image. The object was small, dense, and unmistakably organic. It did not resemble any known ceremonial item, nor did it match medical instruments of the period. Its surface appeared uneven, textured in a way that suggested growth rather than manufacture. It rested unnaturally close to the infant's chest, positioned as if it needed proximity, as if distance would weaken whatever purpose it served. The parents' fingers pressed into it from both sides, not gently but firmly, indicating resistance rather than support. Once fully visible, the object explained everything that had come before. The distorted shadows, the tension in the hands, the focused fear in the parents' eyes, and the urgency implied by the photograph's timing all aligned. This was not something being displayed for remembrance. It was something being contained. The photograph functioned as a kind of seal, a frozen moment meant to prove that control had been achieved, if only briefly. Historical context deepened the dread. Folklore specialists consulted on the findings noted obscure regional beliefs describing transitional states between life and death, moments when something could attach itself to loss, feeding on grief or unfinished bonds. These accounts often involved physical anchors, objects or actions meant to trap or restrain what should not persist. Though such beliefs were dismissed officially, they endured quietly, passed through families rather than institutions. The parents' expressions now made terrible sense. Their faces were not marked by mourning alone but by vigilance. They were not posing for a camera. They were performing a necessary act under observation. The infant, no longer the focus, appeared instead as a catalyst, the reason something else had manifested and needed to be held in place long enough to be documented. The realization settled heavily on the expert. The photograph was never meant to be beautiful nor even remembered. It was evidence, created to reassure its subjects that what they feared had been restrained, contained within the boundaries of that single captured moment. But photographs do not destroy what they record, they preserve it. By enhancing the image, by looking too closely, the expert had not uncovered something new, but had loosened the purpose for which the photograph existed, allowing what was once held only by human hands to linger again, no longer confined to shadow or silence.